For Family by Nanook 888. Chapter 22. The Ties That Bind. A quiet life of earnest hard work and dedication to the Force. The rigors of physical exertion attuning the body and mind. Meditation enabling a closer unity with the Force. Working from the shadows, contributing to the efforts to restore democracy and social order and equality. Just one unsung hand among the many that made up the whole, no more or less remarkable than the next. Living and working alongside family and friends. Right here, right now. That was all Luke wanted.
Adventure,
Master Yoda had admonished.
excitement, and Jedi craves not these things.
Luke would later wonder, since they were all things opposite to adventure and excitement, whether his master might forgive him for this one moment of weakness in wishing that the twists and turns of his life had led him elsewhere. He had long had to make peace with the unavoidable notoriety garnered by simply being a Jedi fighting in the rebellion, and destroying the Death Star had earned him hero worship and hatred alike, uncomfortable both. But this? Is this legitimate, Grand Admiral? Somebody asked. The voice could have belonged to any of the Alliance leaders. Luke could barely hear over the roar of blood rushing in his ears. It is, came the response. Luke only registered it as Piet due to the proximity of the voice by his elbow. The actual meaning of the words clean escaped him. Lord Vader wished for a swift resolution to the war and the restoration of democracy, which I understand he also conveyed to the Alliance party in Theed. But it was also his opinion that his involvement would hinder rather than aid that transition, and so he determined that Master Skywalker should succeed the throne following Palpatine's death. But Emperor? Luke sought Leia's gaze across the flicker of holographic blue. He was unaware that at that moment he particularly resembled a startled Yopi caught in a land speeder's headlight, his glazed blue eyes as round as the Falcon. A shuddering breath eventually escaped him. Oh, Force. Throughout the combined Alliance fleets and across the multitude of hidden cells scattered across the galaxy, Rebel fighters froze for as many seconds as it took for their shock to fizzle into hope, which in turn soared into amazement. Then they erupted in wild elation. In orbit around Naboo, Imperial officers and personnel crammed alongside them in Imperial and Alliance ships alike warily regarded their jubilation. But as they witnessed the euphoric joy of these rebels who had set aside their differences to save the lives of their former enemies, a surprising number of them couldn't help but experience the smallest sliver of hope. The palm-sized holo-transmission of the Imperial emblem condensed into a pebble of blue light that vanished, and the cockpit was once more illuminated by the combined moonshine from Ohmandun and Rory, two of Naboo's moons. There was a heavy sigh. Wedge was left staring at the intricate mosaic of switches and levers surrounding him, the controls to fly the nimble X-Wing like an extension of his own body. He knew that Luke would lose all this, being the Emperor, but it was more than the controls to a starfighter that his friend would lose. Control over his day-to-day life, responsibilities and obligations, the freedom of normalcy, even what little he had being a Jedi. Knowing his friend as he did, Wedge knew that the elevation to the highest seat in the galaxy wouldn't be seen as a blessing. And it was a path that he couldn't follow. Sorry, I can't be your wingman on this one, boss. He wondered when the brilliant pilot would be able to take to the stars again. The old cooker spat and hissed in the dusty kitchen. Tattoo 1 followed Tattoo 2 to scorch the next hemisphere. Moisture collected into a precious droplet of water in one of the many evaporators. All went unnoticed. Fixer and Cammy stared, slack-jawed, at the Imperial emblem, Darth Vader's deathly mask still imprinted on their retinas. Luke Skywalker as in Wormy? Queen Kalantha remembered the unassuming young Jedi who had accompanied the Alliance party during the recent negotiations, and having spent many years as nothing more than an Imperial puppet, felt a considerable sense of relief that she would never have admitted. Pusha Naberi refused to be so reserved, smiling brightly and foregoing all semblance of formal austerity. She was the first to officially acknowledge Emperor Skywalker in a public statement of gratitude to the Rebel Alliance for saving all the people of Naboo. Luke barely heard the leader's excited chatter on the implications of one of the Alliance's own becoming the next emperor. Feeling entirely too overwhelmed, he mumbled an excuse to the hollow figures of his friends and slipped away from the conference table, only to find Pitt at his side before he could reach the door. Luke, Pitt said quietly, informally using his first name now that they were out of the holoprojector's field. I'll escort you if there's anyone in particular you'd like to go, just until you get your bearings. Perhaps to your father's quarters? Luke just about sensed that Piet had picked up on his wanting to be alone, as well as the subtle implication that it might not be wise for him to be wandering around on the Executor alone just now. Of course. Thank you, Piet. They received many odd looks as they traversed the Super Star Destroyer. Not only the Jedi named as Vader's successor, but also the Grand Admiral who strode easily beside him. Even with the natural caution evoked in Imperials by the Jedi's presence, Piet was having to wave away numerous attempts to approach them to verify Vader's message, and Luke found his composure under increased strain the further they went. It was with obvious relief to find the last few corridors leading to what had been his father's private quarters mercifully deserted. Piet indicated the access pad by the sealed doors. I understand Lord Vader set all his security systems to grant you full passage. But he never... Luke trailed off as he remembered the curious few seconds in Theed when his father had taken a swab from his mouth, scanned his eyes, and taken his left palm print. He placed his left hand on the palm reader. It flashed green and the door slid open with a hiss of hydraulics. How long had his father been planning this? For all that the Alliance leaders had worried that Vader wouldn't relinquish the throne when the time came, had his father ever intended to take it in the first place? When had he decided to give his life to defeat Palpatine? Had he even intended to return? You can reach me on my comm if you need anything, Piet said gently, and gestured Luke into the room. Luke numbly stepped past the doors, barely registered Piet sealing them closed behind him. In the gloom of the former Dark Lord's sanctuary, Luke stumbled to a standstill, struck by the concentration of pain and rage and anguish accumulated over the years as though he had smacked head first into a durasteel wall. But interwoven through all that, piercing through the oppressive hold of darkness in recent months, were the lingering traces of desperate hope and a powerful, unconditional love. It brought him to his knees. Struggling against the throbbing ache in his chest at what he had lost, he closed his eyes. But all he could see was the red lightsaber protruding out of the middle of the black cape. He cast his eyes up, fighting tears. His broken gasp cut through the still air. Why, Father? Why did you have to die? Han studied Leia out of the corner of his eyes all through the short hop between ships. At first glance, she seemed perfectly composed, but she was entirely too motionless to be truly calm. She had insisted that she would be fine on her own, but there wasn't a chance that Han was letting her march on board the Super Star Destroyer without him, ceasefire or recent victory or otherwise. They were greeted by Piet himself, accompanied by only 2 officers. Welcome aboard the Executor, Princess Leia. I am relieved to see you safe and well. Lord Vader was most determined to ensure your rescue. Everyone started at this, taken aback by such an inclination from the Dark Lord regarding a rival leader. Leia's torment was due to an entirely different reason. I am grateful for your kind wishes, Grand Admiral, she said smoothly, bringing all her training to bear in concealing her distress. May I present my advisor, Admiral Chirinu, and First Officer of the Executor, Commander Garant. Protocol dictates that a platoon of stormtroopers also be in attendance when welcoming a dignitary on board, but I felt that it may not be the most reassuring gesture under the circumstances. I mean no disrespect, Your Highness. Piet's tone was genuinely sincere, and Leia was starting to agree with Luke's assessment of the man being an honest and valuable ally. The 2 officers with him exchanged a glance, seemingly unsure of what to do with their commanding officer's cordial reception of these rebels. It's very considerate of you, she replied with genuine warmth. We appreciate it. I believe you know General Solo and Chewbacca. Piet nodded to them. Yes, we met them when Lord Vader secreted them on board before our aborted mission to Endor, he revealed, shocking his fellow officers further. Ignoring them, he said to Leia, Now I would invite you for refreshments, but I understand you wish to see Luke. Leia smothered a smile at the expression that she knew would be on Han's face at this Imperial officer referring to their friend in such a familiar manner. Her brief moment of mirth died as Piet continued. He is resting in Lord Vader's private quarters. This way, please. Even with her force sensitivity on mute, Leia could sense enough of the turmoil from Vader's dark years lingering in the air to be distinctly uncomfortable as she stepped in alone and the door shut behind her. Black floor polished until it reflected like the Nabooian lakes in the still of night. Spartan furnishings, everything cold and dark and devoid of life. The whole place reminded her of her incarceration aboard the Death Star when Vader had... She took a deep breath, consciously bringing to mind how he had come to the second Death Star to save her, how he had thrown himself at Palpatine again and again to save her and her brother. The clamoring scratching of dark memories receded, the fear replaced by keen sorrow and guilt. An extended hiss of depressurizing air drew her attention to the large spherical construct in the middle of the room. Its jagged top half yawned open to reveal her brother seated within. Luke, she murmured. Their eyes locked for a long second before she headed across the spotless floor. Luke scooted aside to make room for her. The seat within was large enough to squeeze them both in. It was hard and metallic, like everything else here, with what appeared to be medical equipment fixed all around and on the underside of the lid above them. This was his hyperbaric chamber, Luke said quietly as she settled beside him. Can you imagine? The whole time I was growing up on Tatooine and complaining about being stuck on Uncle Owen's moisture farm for 22 years, he was stuck in the mask or in one of these chambers just to be able to breathe. He sighed. 22 years before his operation. Leia glanced at him in question, certain that Anakin wouldn't have had time to tell him. I've been meditating, Luke explained. Oh, she mouthed silently. He leaned back against the rigid headrest and stared up at the metallic finger suspended above them. He shook his head. It should have been you. Clearly, he was no longer talking about the mask. What should have been me? What do I know about politics? It's critical where the galaxy goes from here. I can't figure out why he announced me as his successor. Oh, that. Her air seemed to become even more sorrowful. You know, he made the right decision. I think he understood. Understood what? He asked, the slight edge in his voice betraying the headache he'd given himself trying to unravel it. Do you see politics in your future, Luke? He answered, even though it was obvious. No. And how about mine? Of course. A sad smile touched Leia's lips. He called this a new beginning, Luke. And I believe that's what he wanted. I really do. You'll be emperor for as long as it takes to oversee the return of democracy. Then it'll be time for new leadership. You'll be known as the Jedi who held the galaxy in his grasp and set it free. And those new leaders, she regarded him with her warm brown eyes. Do you think the galaxy could truly be free of the past if any of those leaders had been named as Darth Vader's successor? For a Jedi who had meditated the nature of his father's operation out of thin air, he felt remarkably dense. Well, when you put it like that, Luke quipped in a half-hearted attempt to lighten the tone. He gave up and sighed. Father always said that politics was our mother's area, but it seems he understood more than he let on. Leia swallowed and turned away. He really loved her, didn't he? Luke's reply was to lay his left hand over hers. The physical contact wasn't necessary to establish a mental link, but it helped, and it was comforting. En route to Palis Massa with an injured and unconscious Leia, Anakin had shared the memory of his secret wedding ceremony at Frigino, and Luke now shared it with Leia. The sparkling lake and the beautiful arbor, but by far the most beautiful was their mother, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, with every feeling one of love, joy, and tranquility. Leia swallowed past a lump that welled up in her throat. He's with her now, he said softly through his own sorrow. However we might feel right now, he had finally found peace. She blinked back tears, shook her head as guilt rushed over her and left her nauseous. The last thing I said to him, Luke. He was apologizing for what he did to me, but I couldn't accept it. I couldn't forgive him. I wanted to hurt him, and I was so cruel, so cruel. If only I could take it back. He knew, Leia. He took both her hands in his. He knew how you felt. Remember this? He recalled the sense of utter peace and love that their father had shared moments before his death and sent it through his connection with Leia. "And this," he said, recalling what had effectively been a blessing.
"Your brother was right about Solo."
"He knew and he wanted you to be happy." She didn't know if that made her feel better or worse. She had been utterly heartless, but his dying wish was for her happiness. And now as she clasped her brother's hands, one organic, the other lost to Vader, and now a prosthetic, she couldn't help but be reminded of what she had almost done to Luke. His senses still connected to her, Luke knew exactly where her thoughts had gone. "Hey," he said firmly, "that wasn't you. You have nothing to be sorry for." "But of course I do! I held Darth Vader in so much contempt, and in the end I proved I was no better." "All that you proved was that the dark side consumes and corrupts. Father turned to the dark side because he was desperate to save our mother, and you were almost driven to it because my life was in danger. And you did save me, Leia. You saved my life. But I almost became what he had become, only because you didn't know what the dark side was. You've never been trained in the Force, never been taught how to draw on the light side and avoid the temptations of the dark side. Do you want to know something? You did a lot better than I did." She frowned, clearly disagreeing. "I had the training, I had all the warnings, but I still almost fell to the dark side. When you were shot on Geonosis, I was afraid that I'd lose you. I was desperately reaching for the Force to try and heal you, but it wasn't the light side that answered my call." "But you didn't turn." "No, Father stopped me just in time, made me aware of what I was doing. So you see, when I went to the Death Star, I knew exactly what I was fighting. But you went in blind, and still held true for as long as you did through sheer strength of will." She stared intently at his prosthetic hand, avoiding his gaze as she voiced her fears. "Our father," she said carefully, tasting the term out loud for the first time, "I believe was a good man, and yet he became Darth Vader. In that throne room, it scares me how easy it was to draw on the dark side. Natural, even. Palpatine clearly saw it too. Looking back now, it's easy to see that it was me that he thought he could turn, not you. How do I know that I won't turn one day, Luke? How do I know that I won't turn to the dark side the next time someone threatens you, or Han, or another planet?" Although it felt like he had lived a lifetime since, it wasn't so very long ago that Master Yoda had helped Luke with the same fears. "Do you know how Father turned back from the dark side?" "Because of you. In a way. It was because there was something he cared about more than power or anything else the dark side could offer. Because to him, I was more important. He couldn't have both, so it was an easy decision for him. What do you care about the most, Leia?" The answer was in her eyes. He didn't need her to say it. "Like Father, you run on intense emotions. But I'll teach you how to use the Force, how to draw on the light side, and even to channel your feelings in a way that doesn't invoke the dark side. Father had the remarkable strength to reject the dark side, the same strength that you have. Hold those you love close to your heart, Leia, and you'll stay with them in the light side of the Force." As she contemplated this, gradually the fearful shadows cleared from deep in her mind, and little by little she felt herself settle at the reassurance. At length, she was left with a muted, somewhat numb sense of emotional exhaustion. "Thank you, Luke." He shrugged against her shoulder. "What are big brothers for?" She turned to him in mock indignation. "Big brother? What makes you think you're the older one?" His eyes took on a telltale glint, and he opened his mouth. "And don't say you meditated," she retorted before he could say precisely that. "You can't just use that to back up every baseless assertion you make, you know." He couldn't help it, he laughed. But grief and overwrought emotions turned the laughter to tears. "Hey, it's getting mighty boring up." Han stopped dead at the sight of Leia and Luke snugly sharing the single seat in what he'd dubbed Vader's egg machine, and would have walked straight back out had it not been for Luke's obvious distress. Kid? Leia waved them over as Luke visibly composed himself. Han shuffled in awkwardly, but Chewie had no such reservation. With a mournful wail, he loped right over to the pod and leaned in awkwardly to engulf them both in his hairy embrace. Han hooked his thumbs on the holster strap hung low over his hips. Is this about Vader? He didn't miss how Leia's eyes flickered to Luke. He hesitated, then decided to plunge right ahead. Or should I say Anakin Skywalker? 3 pairs of startled eyes shot towards him, and he wondered if he should be offended at the surprise. Oh, come on, it might have taken me a while, but he called himself Anakin. I was bound to figure it out sooner or later. Even in his harsh upbringing, the hero with no fear had been famous enough, and Han old enough, for him to have heard of the Jedi Knight during the Clone Wars. Between Vader and Luke, they had left enough clues left, right, and center for Han to put 2 and 2 together. And if that hadn't been enough, Vader had gone and proclaimed Luke as his heir and successor to the whole blasted galaxy. Han still wasn't Vader's biggest fan, but he knew the old man had meant something to Luke. I'm sorry, kid, he said honestly. Luke dropped his head in his hands, his voice heavy. What are you going to do? Han blinked. Do? Luke peered up through the curtain of his hair, studied Han for a long second. Vader was my father, Han. Aren't you angry, suspicious of me? Unusually for Han, he seemed to work through the words in his head before he spoke. I won't go into what I think of Vader. All I know is, I know you. Why would that change? Luke was still staring at his friend. I'm sure nothing like my old man. Why would you be? And I'm not going to go yabbering to everyone, if that's what you're thinking. If you want to, then that's your business. Though personally, I wouldn't call that one of your best ideas. But I do have a bone to pick with you, pal. He continued rounding on the Wookiee. You knew. I know you knew, and you never told me. Chewie shrugged, unrepentant, and roared something. They smelled related? Han repeated. Luke was smiling faintly as he glanced at Leia. Han caught the private look. Something clenched inside him, and he was suddenly not interested in picking this bone with Chewie. He spun on his heel and headed straight for the door. I'll be in the Falcon when you're all ready to go. Han! Han feigned deafness and walked out. Han, it's not what you... The doors closed on Luke's calm voice of reason. Han managed to go another 4 paces before the doors opened behind him, and then another 2 before he was physically hoisted off the ground and carted back to Vader's quarters. Hey, put me down, you oaf! Chewie ignored him and carried him right back to the egg machine. Luke waved a hand, and the doors hissed shut behind them of their own accord. Han, you've got this all wrong, Luke said, sounding rather amused. Han took some comfort from the fact that Leia looked as confused as he did. What is there to get wrong? He demanded. Luke turned to Leia. He thinks that we're... Luke flapped a hand, gesturing the air between them. Oh! Leia breathed, finally understanding all of Han's strange behavior since Geonosis. Oh! She shook her head. Oh no! She said, laughing now. Oh, I see! And even Chewie was smirking. Han was sure of it. See what? He demanded, increasingly frustrated. Leia alone seemed to take pity on him. She hopped out of the egg machine and came over to him, gently took his hand, and gave it a meaningful squeeze. Han! He's my brother! The look of astonishment on Han's face was priceless. A brother? Luke waved cheerfully. Her big brother. Leia rolled her eyes. That's still under debate. Brother? Han repeated. Leia smiled. Chewie began chuckling. Don't tell me. Han suddenly accused the Wookiee. They smelled related. It wasn't my secret to tell, Chewie woofed back. Han couldn't even start to be annoyed, not when Leia was not with Luke, and she was standing there holding his hand. He knew he was grinning inanely, but he didn't care. He looked at her, drinking in the sight of her as he hadn't allowed himself to since he'd first mistakenly convinced himself that she and Luke were together. That was when he noticed her peering at him apprehensively, and he immediately became concerned. He was just about to ask what had happened when he realized... Luke. Vader... Leia. That time on Polis Massa when he'd walked in on what could well have been a funeral for all their misery when Leia couldn't tell him what Luke had told her. Vader was Leia's father! It was shocking, but Han didn't delve into all the complications that one fact could have caused. In his view, it was perfectly simple. Leia was Leia, and that was all there was to it. She hesitantly clutched his hand, unusually timid and anxious as she waited for his reaction at this revelation. And the only thing that mattered was the way he felt about this tiny, amazing woman full of fire and life. How was it that, of all the people in the galaxy, she'd chosen him? All the built-up tension from his misunderstandings since he'd woken on Geonosis ebbed away. Not trusting his voice, all he could do was gather her close in his arms. It was all the answer she needed. Yes, Grand Admiral? I apologize for the interruption, Your Imperial Majesty, Piet said, and Luke knew from his formal address that Piet had an audience. I felt I should inform you that we have been fielding calls for the last half hour, with various dignitaries wishing to congratulate the new successor to the Imperial throne. Luke didn't need to know the ins and outs of politics to know that a hyper portion wouldn't have been genuinely friendly, and Piet was subtly giving him a heads up. It also reminded him that there was a phenomenal amount of work needing attention, not least of which was that he couldn't carry on using one of the most highly developed and armored battleships in the galaxy as his personal office forever. You were right to contact me. I appreciate the update. I will forward the list of callers later. But in view of recent events, I thought perhaps in the meantime you might be interested to hear that the former senator of the Chomel sector, Pooja Naberi, requested an audience at your convenience. Luke met Leia's eyes, both thinking the same thing and suddenly excited and nervous at the same time. Han looked between the two of them, knowing there was yet another thing he wasn't aware of. That's very astute, Grand Admiral, Luke replied, carefully choosing his words. Yes, in view of recent events, perhaps I should see her straight away. Would you mind inviting her on board? Pooja! Leia! They rushed together, clasping arms and regarding each other before embracing. Closely acquainted from the old days serving the Senate, for Leia it was a particularly precious moment knowing now who her friend was. You don't know how happy I am to see you again, Pooja said. You stole the words right out of my mouth, Leia replied with great feeling. Pooja's face was creased with worry. When I heard that Palpatine was holding you on the Death Star, let's not speak about that now. It all turned out okay. Almost all, Leia amended silently to herself. It's been too long, Pooja. Nearly 4 years, I should say. And my, haven't you been busy? Perhaps a little, Leia said with a wry smile. Even just days ago, she would never have imagined that they would be where they were now. She and Luke had much to discuss with Pooja, but they couldn't talk here. They glanced at the attendants waiting patiently behind Pooja and then across at the pilots emerging from a second shuttle, a gleaming silver ship with beautifully sleek lines. 2 ships? Leia asked. Pooja gestured the silver ship proudly. This is a gift from Queen Calantha and the people of Naboo to His Imperial Majesty, Emperor Skywalker. She stopped, then a giggle escaped from between her fingers covering her lips. That's the first time I've ever been happy to say Emperor. Leia couldn't help but share her smile. Pooja recomposed herself and continued with some earnestness. The Royal Naboo Starship was usually reserved solely for use by the Naboo Sovereign, but we would be honored to gift it to His Majesty. This particular ship had been used by Aunt Padme, and although it had been decommissioned after she stepped down as Queen, after her death it was restored to perfect working order at the Royal Dockyards. Such a connection to Amidala, you understand, it holds special significance in the heart of the Nabooian people. We can never repay Emperor Skywalker for saving Naboo, but we can say something of our immeasurable gratitude. I know it's likely to be a while before he'll be able to spare the time for an official ceremony, so I wanted to take this opportunity to present it unofficially in the meantime. We hope that he might be happy to accept it. Moved to tears, Leia regarded the beautiful ship in a new light. You have no idea. Swallowing hard, she clasped Pooja's hand again. I'll talk to Luke. We have something rather important to tell you. Citizens of the galaxy. The whole world narrowed down to one perfectly innocent-looking black object, topped with a chunky, disc-shaped section about the size of a human fist, with a thinner and longer cylinder hanging down from it. The live holorecorder floated several meters in front of the wide conference table and broadcast the fourth message to have wholly commandeered the attention of the entire galaxy in as many standard days. I am Luke Skywalker. As your new emperor, I address you at this pivotal moment in our history. by the blinking stars, but did not feel pretentious. Luke was having to speak through one of his most familiar Jedi calming exercises just to be able to say it with a straight face. Honestly, how had Leia convinced him to say that? Civil War was the answer. There was the potential for many more years of suffering and countless more deaths at stake here, which was why Luke was going along with this madness. Which was precisely what this was. Sheer madness! Yet it somehow perfectly reflected the upheaval that had surged through the galaxy in the past few days since the death of Palpatine and the liberation of Naboo. The greater proportion of the Imperial Navy was under Piet's thumb and had abided by his orders to maintain the ceasefire. In some, it was due to little more than from having sworn allegiance to Lord Vader, and by extension to his will. But in others, it was reinforced by a certain willingness to try for peace, an open-mindedness born in view of the rebels' humanity in aiding the mass evacuation of Imperials from the Death Star. But as Leia and Mothma had predicted, the Imperial ruling council had not sat still at Vader's choice of successor. Even with several leading figures having accompanied Palpatine to Naboo and perished aboard the Death Star, there remained a substantial number of Imperial advisors who had been vociferous in their opposition to a Jedi taking the galactic throne. Officially leading the denunciation was Sait Pastage, who, as the Grand Vizier, had been left in charge on Imperial Center in Palpatine's absence. But there was no question in the leading political minds on both sides as to who was really in charge. Ars Dangor, effectively wielding both Sait Pastage and Yasane Isard from the shadows, had rallied considerable opposition amongst governors, officers, and senior staff, who had once been powerful figures with the weight of Palpatine's authority behind them. He drew on his considerable influence to persuade, demand, coerce, or entice those in positions of authority or influence to support the Imperial ruling council, who themselves were united as never before, while Palpatine had encouraged suspicion and rivalry to keep personal ambitions in check. The very public manifestation of Dangor's opposition had taken the form of Pastage waxing lyrical on the IHV about the inevitable breakdown in order and security should a bloodthirsty terrorist Jedi succeed the august Emperor Palpatine, stirring fear of chaos and anarchy. However, it was for good reason that Mothma and Leia held successive records of the youngest senators ever to serve. Quiet whispers had begun seemingly nowhere and everywhere, spreading like wildfire through the galaxy and counteracting Pastage's words of poison. Through industrial quarters and rural backwaters, the affluent heights, and the murky underworld of miles-high cities alike. Revelations of Palpatine's atrocities, his role behind the Clone Wars, and false accusations of the Jedi Order, accompanied by murmurings of liberation. The appellation, in irreverent tones that had not been heard in over 2 decades, of the Jedi. And nowhere had this quiet work been so prevalent than on Imperial Center, or Coruscant, as many seemed eager to call it again. As Luke stepped onto the lush carpet of one of the spacious external docking bays of the Imperial Palace, accompanied by Mothma, Leia, Han, Chewie, Piet, Chiraiu, and 3 officers from Death Squadron, and guarded by several units of the 501st Legion, they had been greeted by the astonishing sight of the surrounding walkways, verandas, and building tops packed full of people vying for a view, not calling out for their blood, as would have been the case only several days ago, but cheering! Through their strengthening connection in the Force, Luke had asked of Leia, "Why do I get the feeling that you had something to do with this?" "We gave an extra nudge, that's all," she had replied. "Palpatine and Father's 2 broadcasts pretty much did the job for us." An extra nudge? Ever heard of our sleeper agents? Luke had been aware of the Alliance's growing network of sleeper agents and High Command's recent schemes to fracture the Empire from within. But he had no idea of how extensive this network had been or how close they had been to deploying that strategy. And now, as he gave his first ever public address, it was to all these people that he spoke, to the countless numbers who blindly placed their hopes in him, not only humans but of all species, to his friends, to the survivors still standing with him, and to the brave departed. Empowered by the Force, his body relaxed and his mind fixed on the task at hand, he locked his eyes on the floating holorecorder. In this galaxy, we are blessed with a wealth of different people and species, with their individual cultures and distinctions and strengths. and all of us, spread far and wide, are united in purpose. The basic and equal rights of all individuals, regardless of species, gender, class, or creed. Respect for individuality and tolerance of differing thoughts. Regulation of executive powers to prevent abuse of authority. And a society in which its citizens have a voice. From the journalists in the adjoining chamber, questions and expressions of shock instantly greeted this audacious proclamation that perfectly contradicted Palpatine's enforced ideals. The prestige of receiving invitations to this inaugural speech from the new emperor were momentarily forgotten, pressing forward with their hovering media cams towards the transparent wall separating them. They demanded clarification and confirmation that His Majesty was indeed saying what it sounded like he was saying. The three advisors from Palpatine's ruling council in attendance struggled to contain their outrage before the holo recorder. Beyond Piet and Leia to Luke's left, Dangor, ghost-like in his habitual dark robe and head covering, managed to contain any obvious outward expression of his fury save for the scorching glint in his manic eyes. Beyond Mothma to Luke's right, Pistage, opulently attired in his outfit rather resembling an exotic prancing bird in Han's opinion, was just as lurid in his spluttering outrage. And beside Pistage, Isard turned a rather brilliant shade that clashed with the symbolic crimson that she had decked herself in to match the uniform of what had formerly been the Imperial Royal Guard. Han wondered at the further symbolism that the Royal Guard had been disbanded by the 501st. The advisors had been none too pleased at the summons from Emperor Skywalker to attend him within a section of the Imperial Palace that he had secured for himself. They had been further enraged when they had been outmaneuvered by the unannounced arrival of the journalists to sit alongside him as though in support of this outrageous speech, and moreover to be delegated to the seats furthest from him, blatantly scattered on the fringes for the whole galaxy to see. And now this. The rebel emperor had cited the same basic principles of democracy revered by the Old Republic, the very same principles which the venerable Emperor Palpatine had in his infinite wisdom eliminated. Luke allowed the uproar for several seconds before he held up a hand. Unexpectedly, there was instant silence. He was unaware of the spell he wove, his connection to the Force creating an aura of steadfast assurance that held all others in thrall, even though they could neither consciously sense it nor explain it. He spoke without pause, allowing no disruptions. Citizens of the galaxy, my pledge to you this day is made in all sincerity. Throughout my life, I dedicate myself to your service, and I shall strive to be worthy of your trust. In this spirit, I shall speak the truth. There can be no dark secrets hanging over us as we establish this new age, and it is for this reason alone that I now reveal something so personal. I am not here to claim right or wrong. I simply tell you how matters stand. You are free to believe, or not, as you wish. My father was a Jedi Knight. He fought in the Clone Wars, believing, as many did, that the Separatists were attempting to destabilize the Republic, and that the key to regaining peace lay in ending the Separatist threat. It was against this backdrop of war and death that my father learned of his wife's pregnancy. What began as the happiest day of his life ended as the beginning of the end. Luke borrowed the words Obi-Wan had once spoken to him. The Force is what gives a Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It binds the galaxy together. That night, and many times afterwards, the Force showed my father a vision of my mother dying in childbirth. He had seen visions in the past that had foretold death as they came to pass, and so he believed these also to be true. He sought high and low for a way to prevent her death. The one who offered an answer was the Sith Master Palpatine, who at the time was concealing his true nature as he orchestrated the Clone Wars, leading the Separatists in secret against the very Republic of which he was the Supreme Chancellor. Palpatine promised my father the power to save my mother, and haunted by the visions, my father believed him. There is a dark side to the Force. The dark side devours any hint of humanity until all that remains is evil. If a Jedi falls to the dark side, it is the death of him. He desires only power. He triumphs in killing those who he used to hold most dear, revel in unspeakable acts of savagery. He is no longer the same person in mind or spirit, and no amount of reason or plea or persuasion can bring him back. That was the power that Palpatine gave my father. The power of the Sith. My father died in the pursuit of what he believed to be the only way to save my mother, and became a different being entirely. My father, Anakin Skywalker, died, and in his place was born Darth Vader. Luke remained stoical against the shocked outcries from the journalists. Amidst the commotion, they could clearly hear, "Vader's son!" repeated more frequently than Luke would have liked. He had prepared himself for this, and it was understandable, what with Vader being much more prominent in their minds than a Jedi Knight of a distant past. But he still couldn't help the sting of regret. Bastage and Isard were frozen, their faces ashen. Dangor merely frowned. It had been one of the conclusions of a lengthy and shocking discussion with Alliance High Command, with Piet also in attendance, that Luke would make this disclosure. There were too many people hunting relentlessly for the reason why Vader had remarkably named a Jedi as his heir, and the risk of it coming out in the future was all too real. The damage that such a revelation could cause after they had rebuilt the galaxy was all too severe, so instead of sowing seeds of blackmail, Luke took the proactive approach in making the admission himself at the start, when there was still little to lose. For Luke and Leia, there was also the added desire to explain the tragic events in a matter of their choosing, to mark the distinction between Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader. One shrill voice rose above the din of the journalists. "Who is your mother?" The air became thick with expectation. Who she was is not relevant here, and for the protection of her family, I respectfully request your forbearance in maintaining her anonymity. There was a smattering of protest, although not all voiced their demand out loud. Back in their respective media station research departments, however, there ignited a flurry of activity in an attempt to discover the identity of the wife of Anakin Skywalker, the wife of Darth Vader. There was still one point to make. Ignoring it all, Luke caught Leia's eyes. "Let's do this," she thought in her mind, knowing her brother would hear. "I'm right here beside you, Luke, whatever happens." Firmly keeping himself anchored in the Force and maintaining his composure, he continued. "However, I can disclose that my mother gave birth to not one child, but to two. I have a twin." The journalists and Imperial advisors froze with bated breath. As the offspring of Anakin Skywalker, we would have been a threat to the newly formed Empire. None but 2 Jedi and a senator knew the truth of our births. To protect us both, as well as the galaxy, should we have been turned into agents of evil, my twin and I were raised separately and in secret, hidden from the Empire, from Palpatine and Vader. I was taken in by distant relatives in the Outer Rim territories. My twin sister was adopted by the senator and his wife, the late Prince Bail Organa and Queen Breha Organa. You all know my sister as Princess Leia Organa of the Royal House of Alderaan. The journalists appeared to have run out of steam. After so many shocking revelations, they now merely turned in silent astonishment to the princess sitting calmly beside the Jedi. Although aware that this was by far a most unusual way to address the galaxy, Luke had sworn to speak the truth. And speak the truth he did, for the story did not end with Darth Vader, but with Anakin Skywalker. To Luke and Leia, it made all the difference. For 22 years, Vader believed that the child of his former self had died with his wife. Luke could practically see the researchers updating their search parameters for his mother's identity with this piece of information. It was only when he heard of my name, the rebel pilot who had destroyed the first Death Star at Yavin, that he learned that I lived. He searched for me, and during that search, he learned of his second child. But he was not alone in realizing that the children of Anakin Skywalker still lived. Palpatine also learned of this and sought to bring us under his control. That was to be the start of Vader's redemption. It had been in desperation to save my mother that Anakin Skywalker had been lost to the dark side. And it was his determination to defend his children from Palpatine that Vader freed himself from the grip of the dark side. By the time of the recent peace negotiations at Theed, Darth Vader had been redeemed as Anakin Skywalker. The only proof I can give you of this is in his efforts, through his continued masquerade as Darth Vader, to utilize his position in the Imperial forces, to aid the Alliance in freeing the galaxy from Palpatine. You all bore witness as Palpatine threatened to destroy his own home planet of Naboo with the second Death Star. He had discovered my father's treachery, that Darth Vader was no more, and sought to coerce either myself or my sister to serve as our father's replacement. You all bore witness of the holo recording as I met with Palpatine, while the brave men and women of the Imperial forces and the Alliance fought side by side to save Naboo. Details of the battle will be released through official channels in due course, so for now, all I will have to say of it is this." And here Luke was forced to pause, to swallow past the lump in his throat that refused to be swallowed down. "Anakin Skywalker gave his life to save us all."